Hello everyone, and welcome back to another video of 1776 American Patriot. It's been quite some time since I've made a video. Um, I felt that my first few videos covered a lot of ground, um, and I wanted to see what was going to happen with our Constitution and the effect that the coronavirus is having. Um, Basically, my fear at the time a year ago when I started making these videos was that we were going to head down the slippery slope and loss of freedoms and liberties, and I would say that fear is coming to fruition. Um, Feel free to disagree or agree in the comments down below. But some of the main points that I was talking about a year ago was the idea that absolute power corrupts absolutely. And I think we have seen, and there are discussions now in many states about how much power an executive or chief officer, or in other words, a governor, should have in a state or a locality. Um, Many states ran into the situation where the only one that could end the emergency declaration was, in fact, the governor, and the legislatures were essentially suspended. We've seen some of that ease with the coronavirus cases and deaths go down. However, there seems to be a fear now of the Delta variant, and my concern is that we're going to once again see increasing restrictions. Um, it's very apparent that Washington is calling for more restrictions at this point, and I just wanted to personally thank Rand Paul for the work that he's doing, uh, looking at the numbers and looking at um, the facts of different methods that we're using. And I had made a case looking at Sweden over a year ago that if you have less restrictions versus lockdowns and mask requirements, that it really was having no effect on the overall death rate. And we can now see that with Florida and California that has held true even in the United States. And Rand Paul, to his credit, has been talking about that. He's also been talking about the fact that the masks themselves, the paper masks themselves, or the cloth masks, excuse me, themselves, the particles of the virus move through there. They're too small for that to offer protection, and the fact that may be harmful, because if you are wearing that well-meaning to protect those that are vulnerable, uh, you may become not as careful as if you were not wearing the mask. And if the mask is not protecting you like you think that it should, then you're actually exposing those individuals to the virus. My position has always been, yes, the virus exists, but the virus does not attack all segments of the population equally. So there are certain members of the population that are at more risk than others. And the evidence has been suggesting that children are not vulnerable to this virus, and they're very unlikely to spread the virus. And so I would say that it's really um, not beneficial to the children's development to have them masked and to have them not in-person school. The vaccine, there's been a lot of questions about the vaccine, and of course, I can't make that decision for you of whether or not to get or not get the vaccine. I think that's a question of individual liberty and choice, that you should be able to make medical decisions for yourself. I mean, those are some of the things that we have learned as a free society, is that we get to make those kinds of decisions for ourselves. There's a long history of that, and some of that is rooted in World War II and what had happened in Nazi Germany, where people were experimented on and forced to into medical experiments is that they did not consent to. And so part of being a free society is being able to make our own choices. I understand that some people will say, well, you need to do it in order to protect me, right? Another person. And so therefore your liberty argument does not hold water because your freedoms end where my nose begins, and in this case you're going to infect me. But the research and the studies are not showing that to be the case. Those that are vaccinated are not becoming infected by the unvaccinated. So I believe I'm going to use the same verbiage, but my freedom ends where your nose begins. And if I'm not infecting you, what is the risk to you? Um, you're vaccinated, you're protected. I'm the one that's taking the risk, and again, all risks are not equal. So if we look at populations that are older and non-childbearing, it may very well be in their best interest to take the vaccine to protect themselves. Or if you have comorbidities, that may be the decision for you. But let's say you're young, 12, 13, 17, 18 years old, and otherwise healthy as far as that we can tell. There are possible side effects to the vaccine, and we don't know what those are because it is an experimental vaccine, even if it has been approved for emergency authorization. But why would another otherwise healthy individual risk experimental effects if they don't have any reason to think that they wouldn't survive the disease if they're infected with the virus? And it seems like it would be more risky for that population to get the vaccine because we don't know how that's going to affect them 10, 20, 30, 40 years from now. But if you're older, then we do have the numbers on what not being vaccinated are, and being free, educated, democratic society, people should be able to make that decision for themselves. I don't think that's something that the state should be making for us. I think that's an overreach and abuse of power. Um, I also don't think that any of the evidence is showing that there's a risk to those that have chosen to get vaccinated. Um, my basic belief, and you could feel free to disagree with it because that's part of my belief, is that we can have debate and discussion in a civil manner, which is also something that we really need to get back to doing rather than name calling each other or assuming that the other person is less intelligent because they have a different way of thinking. We need to get away from that because the hallmark of our society is that we've been able to have civil discourse, and then there's a process in order to legislate and make laws, which is also reviewed by the Supreme Court, which has created the longest lasting democracy to date, or still in operation right now in the world. So this is almost getting into another side discussion, but there is a reason why we have separation of powers, and I touched on that in my earlier videos. We have the separation of powers because our nation was born out of a revolution with an absolute monarch, King George. And the problem with that was that absolute power corrupts absolutely, which is a famous quote. I encourage you to look that up and read through the reasonings for that statement. But essentially, the founders were trying to intentionally take power and to chop it into different pieces so that no one had all the pieces themselves. They weren't the judge, the jury, and the executioner. So how the system was originally designed, and this is an oversimplification, but the system is designed to have conflict and to potentially move slowly. So, like it says in the originating documents, government should not be changed for light and transient causes, right? So we shouldn't just sway back and forth with each whim. So we have the executive branch, which is the office of the president, and it has its powers defined by the Constitution. We have the legislative branch, which consists of two houses, which is uh, the House and the Senate. And the House served for 2 years, and that's supposed to be the House of the people. And the you have the House, the Senate, which is supposed to be the longer serving House, or more of the existing government's representation, because they serve for 6 years and they rotate every in thirds, right? So that there's not always this huge top coming off all of the time. And then you have the judicial branch, which is supposed to take a look at laws that are made and actions by the executive government and say, is this constitutional? Is this not constitutional? And so it's a system of checks and balances. Okay. So that's super important because we don't want one faction being able to dominate the other faction. Um, a lot of thinking out there is that a simple majority is always going to be able to carry the day, but that's really not the way that our system works all of the time. There are lots of issues that require 75% or three-quarters of agreement. And the reason for that is that we want to be really, really sure before we change some of these major components. We also have spheres of rights. We have the federal government's rights, which are defined in the Constitution with the 13 original powers. And then we have the state powers, which are essentially everything that is not the powers of the federal government. But then we also have the individual rights, which are, according to the founders, and I believe this, ordained by God. And these powers are first laid out in the original 10 Bill of Rights, and then we've expanded those since the time of the original document, which the founders designed the Constitution on purpose to be a living document, which means it can be changed. It just has to, there are processes for how to change it. So, for example, we don't want the executive branch just to be able to rule through executive order, whether it's a Republican office or a Democrat in office. We want them to stay within the scope of those powers, and when they start expanding those powers, it's eroding others' powers, right? So if the president has more power, then that's going to come either from the Supreme Court or it's going to come from the legislative branch. So there's this intentional tension between the powers, or it could come from the people, right? So, for example, all the way back to the vaccine, the idea of liberty, right? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. If we take power away from the individual, then that power goes into the state or the federal government. So, if, for example, you wanted to change the Constitution, something actually in the Constitution that was pretty big, you can do that, but you have to ratify with three-quarters of the state. Okay, and it's more complicated than even that. There's processes and ways for them to do it. And I encourage you to read through the Constitution, and you can disagree with what's there. I mean, that's the genius of the system, is the system itself recognizes that it's open to criticism, and that's fine. But I would encourage you. There's an old saying about fences. So, young man buys a farm, and there's this fence that he can't figure out what it's for, and an older farmer that lives down the street says, "Well, I'd be careful about tearing down any fences if you don't know what they're for." And the young man's not really listening, and he tears down the fence. Well, another month goes by, and you get into fall, and it turns out that there's a migration of animals that come through there at that time, and it takes out his farm, his garden, right? They eat all the food and things like that. And so basically the saying is that don't tear down fences until you know why they were put there in the first place. And so what I'm cautioning, or what I'm saying, is before we start to tear down our system, which seems to be what's going on right now, if you look at what's going on with all of the riots and violence and defunding of the police, there seems to be a call for tearing down the American version of democracy. But we need to remember all those fences were put there for a reason. the founders weren't stupid. They were not perfect people, and I understand the criticism on certain things. But they were full of contradictions. They were human beings, and they discussed their faults. There's some really great documentaries out there where they recognize and they call each other out. You know, hey, you're Thomas Jefferson, for example. You're arguing that we should free the slaves, but you have slaves yourself. Okay, slavery is a horrible, horrible thing, and it's unfortunate that it happened. But we have to remember that Thomas Jefferson was also one of the ones advocating for the abolition of slavery. Okay, um, it's really hard when you're in the time that you're in to see the things that you should do or to be able to change the things that you need to change. Okay, so I'm sure that a generation or two from now, they'll look back on us and say, "What were you doing?" And we'll say, "Well, that's the way that it was." It doesn't make it okay. It doesn't make it right. But I think it's really difficult for us to judge previous generations by the norms that are in place now, because there were wars and there were history in between, and there are things about the world that I'd like to change right now, but I know that I don't have the power to change them, injustices and things like that. So um, the founders were aware of not all, but a lot of their contradictions, and they knew that things like slavery were wrong and they were a problem. Um, but they also were not able. Thomas Jefferson was even quoted in saying, you know, basically that this problem will have to be fought. I'm not going to quote it exactly, but the problem of slavery will be decided by a later generation, and there'll be a war. And he was right. He also debated Alexander Hamilton, over the idea of putting all of the financial power in Washington in the Federal Reserve, because his argument was that by doing that, you will make the cabbage farmer a slave to the stock market in Washington, which would be a slave to the stock market in London. Okay, so a lot of the economic problems that we're seeing right now, I think, are Jefferson's warning to Hamilton, right? Sure, it gives the federal government more power to do that. You give them more power when you allow them to be the creditor, right? But it also means that it takes power from the state and the localities, and we see that play out in lots of different scenarios. Whether you agree or disagree with how that coercion occurs, the coercion exists, and I think really what the founders were trying to do was say, look, right now you're okay with the power being used to coerce this way, but what happens when it's used against you? So, in order to protect all of us, we have to accept the fact that things are going to occur that we may not want, but in order to get what we want, we have to protect what someone else's wants, right? It's the same thing with justice. If we don't have the right to an attorney and a due process, if we take those things away because, hey, that guy's really bad, and he may be, right? That means we lose it for ourselves. So when we erode the rights of others, we actually erode the protections for ourselves. There's a famous quote from World War II in Nazi Germany, and I'm not going to quote it exactly, but it essentially says, hey, when they came for this group of people, I didn't say anything because it wasn't me. When they came for this group of people, I didn't say anything because it wasn't me. And they do this 3 or 4 times. And finally, hey, when they came for me, there was no one to help me. And if I'm being honest, that's really what I'm concerned about in our society right now. People are being canceled for stating an opinion, which should be covered under the First Amendment, right? Um, so right now, you may not agree with what that person is saying, and you think, yeah, we should get that guy or that gal. But what happens when it gets to you and no one's there to protect your right? So there's another saying that says, I may not agree with what you said, but I'll defend your right to say it. So there are some ugly ideas out there. Okay, this gets into the marketplace of ideas. There are some truly ugly, evil, nasty ideas out there. But if those ideas are suppressed and not forced to compete in the marketplace of ideas, then what's them to stop from oppressing others, myself or you, who might have great ideas, or they might be really bad ideas, right? I'm sure some of you think right now I'm a wacko, but and that's fine. That's your right to think I'm a wacko. Um, but my um, video is going to go out and compete with other ideas and videos in the marketplace of ideas. And if I have good ideas, it'll bubble to the top. If I have terrible ideas, I'll be relegated to the edges of society. But that can only occur, the marketplace of ideas can only occur in the public space and can only occur if there's freedom to say those ideas without the risk of being canceled. So we've got a lot going on right now because it's not like there's one thing in the Constitution that's under attack. It's pretty much the entire document, the entire philosophy of the Enlightenment, the entire Western culture. And I guess I'm making these videos because I want my children and grandchildren to know, and the other coming generations to know. At least I didn't agree with what's happening. That there were people like me that saw what's happening, and that there were those of us that were trying to at least speak and say, we need to think about this. We need to not tear the fence down until we have time to understand why the fence is there. So, to my grandchildren and great grandchildren and my children and their children and grandchildren, I hope that you are living in a free society with individual rights, state rights, and federal rights. And I hope that you are able to speak your mind and say your piece without the fear of persecution. I hope that you're able to make choices for yourself about how you live your life, what you put into your body, and what you don't put into your body. But if you are living in an oppressive society and you're somehow able to see this, I hope that this will give you hope that at least there was a time when people were free. God bless you all, and thank you for listening. And if you disagree, that's fine. Please make an argument in the comments below. Consider doing it in a civil manner. Again, I can't force you or require you to do that. But that's the hallmark of what this country was built on: civil discourse and disagreement, and compromise at the end of the day. God bless you. Take care.